What Ryan didn't tell you that they always keep the best talks for right after lunch, because this is when the audience is most engaged. So I'll try and keep you engaged. And what I'm going to be talking about today is from lean startup to lean enterprise. And just to give you a little bit about a background about why I'm talking about this topic. I joined a company called Itamar a little over 4 years ago. There were about 20 people in the R&D org. Today, we're over 250, not including third-party developers, contractors, and so on. And throughout these 4 years, it was basically my job, first as an individual contributor, later on as a team lead, and finally as a group manager, to make sure that we don't implode, basically. That we continue to grow our operations, the way that we're structured, the tools that we use, the processes that we use in a way that allows us to support this massive scale. And I want to share a few best practices, lessons learned from those experiences, but I first want to start by spending maybe one more minute talking about the problem. And I think Ben Horowitz, which some of you may know, really put it best when he said, the one obvious yet underappreciated law of business physics is the larger the company becomes, the more opportunities emerge to screw it up. So this talk is all about not screwing it up. And this is a real problem because when we think about scaling, what really happens is not that picture on the left over there. It's not taking this like tiny IKEA bridge and just building a slightly larger IKEA bridge. It's more like taking that bridge and now trying to build something as big as the Golden Gate Bridge. Keep that sort of weird analogy in mind. I'm going to try and come back to it as I go along in my talk. But you can probably tell that things just get a lot more complicated in scale. Coordination becomes more complicated. Collaboration becomes more complicated. Project management, knowledge management, all of those things need different solutions to them as we get bigger. And let's start by talking about decision making first, because it's one of the most essential things that businesses do. Businesses make decisions. And those decisions, in the end of the day, lead to outcomes. Again, think about what it means, what decision-making mean in the context of trying to build something as small as that IKEA bridge. It's probably just me. I just make a decision. I have all the context that I need. When we're trying to take on an endeavor as large as building something as large as a Golden Gate Bridge, well, the executive team at the top can't make every decision about what nuts and bolts to use in every part. And part of the problem is that in many small to mid-sized organizations, they're usually organized functionally, right? So we have a VP of product, VP of engineering, VP of marketing, and so on. One of the biggest problems with that setup is that the management team is the only stable, long-lasting, cross-functional team in the company. Everybody else is organized functionally. So that is the only team that is capable of making cross-functional decisions, and clearly that doesn't scale. So how do you fix it? You fix it by creating more stable, long-lasting, cross-functional teams. At Itamar, we call these teams core teams, and those are cross-functional teams that have full decision-making autonomy on different parts of our business, namely a product or a product line. They're usually led by a product manager, and they have representatives from ops, from sales, from marketing, and from engineering in all of them. But some members or some teams also choose to add other stakeholders. Members on those teams have a dual responsibility. They're responsible for representing their functional organization within the core team, but they're also responsible for representing the core team back in their functional organization. And then lastly, we've tied this all together around an operating rhythm and a structure of accountability. So those teams meet weekly to discuss these matters, and they publish their meeting notes in a very transparent way on the wiki. So even if I'm not part of a core team, I want to know what's going on, I simply watch the page and I get the updates. as you may have guessed, the information on who is on what team is on the wiki. And you can clearly see here that there's a consistency. We have the product manager, solution marketing, which is our marketing function, ops and engineering on each one of the core teams. And then a few other core teams have invited other stakeholders to consistently participate in the meetings. This is an example of a core team meeting notes page. And you see that it starts actually with the way that they run their meetings. So they spend the first 5 minutes doing a lightning round, basically soliciting agenda items that they should be covering during their meeting. Then they look at a more quantitative view of their product, rolled up in some sort of a dashboard. The bulk of the time is spent talking about the discussion topics that were identified earlier on, and then finally they wrap up by really 2 important functions. One is rolling up all the decisions and the action items that need to be taken following the core team meeting. And the other one, which is just as important, is figuring out what information needs to be disseminated outside of the team. Let's talk about knowledge management. Another really important and challenging problem as you scale. Again, think about our bridge analogy. I can probably fit all the knowledge that's needed for constructing this tiny IKEA bridge in like this one of those like 2-pager IKEA manuals. If I were to create one for how to build the next Golden Gate Bridge, it's probably going to be a little bigger than that. So I think if you've been part of a semi-large organization, you've experienced this problem yourself. This notion of a single source of truth becomes really, really hard. Information gets stored in Google Docs, in Salesforce, in Confluence, in Jira. Can go on and on, but I think that you get the picture. So how do you solve this? And in my opinion, trying to implement some sort of a very centralized command and control way to solving this problem doesn't really work. What we use instead is what we call the national park parable. And I want to walk you through it for a second. So if you've been to a national park, you know that there's a very small section of the park in general that is really well maintained, really tightly groomed by the park rangers. It has signs, restrooms, concession stands. And that very high foot traffic area ends up serving the needs of about 90% of the park visitors. And then there's those other 10%, the weird people like me that actually go backpacking and go outside of those trails to the parts of the park in which nature is really left unattended and kind of like allowed to grow naturally without a lot of supervision or interruption. This is the same way that we think primarily about our wiki. So we have a very small portion of the wiki that is heavily curated. We have official pages that go through a Wikipedia-like editorial process. We have page owners assigned to those pages that are responsible for making sure that they're up to date. But the vast majority of the content, everybody can create it. There's not a lot of oversight. You just create what you need. Another really important aspect in this strategy is we try to avoid duplication of content as much as possible. Instead of duplicating content between systems, we integrate them. And in a second, I'll give you an example of what that looks like. So here you have real-life examples of the 2 parts of the wiki, the uncurated and the curated part. And they may look a little bit quite the same at first glance, but if we drill just a little deeper, if you take just a slightly longer look at them, you can start seeing the differences. So on the left-hand side, we have a page from the uncurated part of the wiki, and not surprisingly, the last time it's been updated is in May 2011. So it's probably not up to date. I think that's a fair bet, but that's okay. On the right-hand side, however, you see a page from our curated part of the wiki. And this little icon that you see next to the page home that says that it's currently published, basically shows you the part of the workflow that this page is in. So this is an official page, and it's been published. And the name of the person responsible for keeping this page shows up in this other box that's highlighted there, saying that this page is being actively maintained and curated. And if there are any questions about the content, something that's out of order or anything like that, here's the person that you should be talking to about this. I mentioned integration, and this is a really good example. We keep information about what products we've sold to which clients in Salesforce, right? It sells information. This is the natural information system for that kind of data to live in. But guess what? There are other people inside the company that cares about this content, not just salespeople. Engineers want to know that information as well, and they don't have Salesforce accounts. And probably paying $2,000 a year to getting each one of them one is not a smart idea. So what do we do instead? We use a connector, and we reflect the information from Salesforce onto a wiki page so that a much larger group of stakeholders can access the small portion of information that's really relevant to all of them. My colleague, Rebecca Glassman, has given a talk, a fully deeper dive talk on this exact topic of knowledge management in last year's summit. And if you want to know more about this, if this is something that's really close to you, I would strongly encourage you to go and check out her talk. Which leads us to talking about one of my favorite topics, which is project management. And one of the interesting challenges in scaling project management with software development is that this fine acronym at the top there stands for, there ain't no such thing as a full stack feature team. I know we keep talking about this, but as you scale as an organization, you kind of learn that it's a myth. The type of things that we try, the type of endeavors that we try to undertake are just too large for a single team to handle on its own. And try as you must to keep them self-sustaining and self-organizing, they are eventually going to be dependent on work done by other teams. That's just reality. That's just life. So because software development then becomes much more social in nature, managing your own team scope becomes your second problem. Your first problem becomes managing your dependencies on other teams. And if you want to do that well, you have to treat those risks and those dependencies as first-class citizens, right? They're not just metadata that's captured on issue links within the system. They need to be their own objects. They need to have their own workflow. So this is how we do it. In our system, we have an issue type for a dependency. That issue type goes through its own unique workflow for dependencies, starting with requested, an opportunity to request more information. It gets committed by the team who's been asked to do the work, and finally it gets delivered. And for us, we've also found it useful to group those dependencies by the requesting team rather than by the team that needs to do the work, because that gives us a more holistic view of what do we need to do in order to unblock this particular team. What do we need to do in order to really unlock value? And project management is a really good segue to talk about planning a little bit broader. Again, think about our analogy. I'm trying to bring this small bridge to build it. It's me, it's my buddy. Planning how we're going to go about doing this is really not a big deal. But when I'm trying to undertake efforts as large as building the next Golden Gate Bridge, planning becomes a beast of its own, and I really need to be thoughtful about how I'm going to go about doing that. And here's the problem. We're managing a large product portfolio, and this nice two-level, two-hierarchy level requirement, right? We have tasks or user stories, and then we have epics or features. It just doesn't scale. Here I ran a query for searching all the open features in our systems currently, and I ended up with 791 features. I don't know about you, but there's no way that I can make sense out of 791 different tickets. I need some better way to organize this information. So the next step was to simply introduce another level to the hierarchy. And in our system, we distinguish between initiatives, features, and then stories. Initiatives are the largest containers. They're usually either new products or new substantial additions to existing products. They're usually something that's going to take a team about a quarter to work on, so multiple releases within that quarter. We try to keep them right-sized to about a quarter. Some may span longer. Features are things that can usually be completed by a team in an iteration. Again, a distinct slice of value, but that's roughly its size. And then we have our traditional stories, tasks, call them whatever you need. Notice that I've spent equal amount of time talking about the notion of those containers really representing value, but also talking about their size. We're making a very concerted effort in our organization to right-size things rather than to play around with story point estimations, because we're running an experiment right now under the hypothesis that that's going to allow us to be more predictable in the way we go about doing work. Just to illustrate how this actually plans out with a real example, this is a little bit hard to read, but I'll walk you through it. So at the top of the hierarchy there, we have our initiative. Our initiative here is a product that's called the rate analysis tool. We're in the electricity space. We build software for utilities. And this is a tool that helps you as a customer when you have multiple options of electric rates that you can choose from to figure out what is the right rate for you based on your own personalized usage. This then breaks down into a bunch of features, the minimal marketable feature, a set of hypotheticals that you can run, additional details that you can get on the rates, and a few other enhancements. And then once we double-click on one of the features, let's say hypotheticals, then we get to the normal stories, things that can be implemented by developers, such as, I want to see what happens when I shift my peak usage from this hour of the day to the other hour of the day, and so on. Each one of those levels in our hierarchy also go through a unique workflow that marries itself to the purpose of each one of those levels. So initiatives start with opportunity exploration, go to validation, prioritization, then they get committed and gets added to the roadmap, execution, in market, and just as importantly, there's another step of making sure that we got the value that we wanted out of it. Otherwise, we need to go back to the drawing board. Features go from backlog to scoping to release backlog, iteration planning, development, and they finally go live. And for user stories, we have our typical developer workflow. This blue trapezoid is sort of the decomposition trapezoid. So that basically indicates when things get broken down from one level to the next, and when things roll up, when things need to be completed and rolled up in order to move on to the next step. The other really important notion here is this notion of a work state leader. So if you're taking a step back, there are names on each one of those boxes. That is the name of the role that's responsible for making sure that things move to the next step, to accept work into the queue, and to make sure that it's ready to move forward. Now, there's a really important distinction here. That person is not responsible for doing the work themselves. They're responsible for making sure that the work gets done. It's a really important nuance, but that's exactly the thing that prevents work from just being thrown over the wall. This is how it actually plays out in real life. We have an agile board for initiatives, for features, and finally for user stories, and how awesome would it be if I can create this view, not just with screenshots. But moving on, because we're getting a little bit short on time, I want to spend a few minutes talking about how do we scale collaboration. This is how we used to do roadmap planning circa 2011. But the problem is that meetings don't scale well. You can get 5 people in the room and talk about things. Making decisions with 30 people in the room doesn't really work. If you haven't read A Simple Rule to Eliminate Useless Meetings by Jeff Weiner, you should. Basically what he's saying is that meetings suck is a really poor tool for information dissemination. And therefore, he's a strong advocate of eliminating PowerPoint presentations during meetings. And then if you haven't, the other really useful resource is Urban Airship's meeting rules. Here are just a few of them. There are a few others there. We're not using them consistently, but when we do, we definitely get to reap the rewards. So this is how we do road mapping today. We have 2 separate parts for road mapping. The first one is a science fair. This is the major vehicle for information dissemination. The second one is a set of deep dives when we actually go and hash through the details, although we don't do it quite as literally deep dives as those people here in the Maldives. Each team in preparation for the session creates a wiki page that we've created a live template for, and it has more open-ended sections like this planning canvas on the right, on the left, and automatically populated sections that we pull out of Jira on the right. We then print these out. We blow these out on massive posters, and we hang them on the wall. As you can see here, there are people in both coasts participating in the science fair. We have 2 versions of these. And you also see one of the most important ingredients for a successful science fair, which is food, as always. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to wrap it up here. Definitely happy to take on questions through that Q&A tool later on. Thank you.